The humidity was thick enough to leave a film on the back of my neck. Thunder rolled somewhere out over the Atlantic, a low, sustained vibration that rattled the loose window panes of the sprawling coastal house. I stood on the enclosed porch, the smell of approaching rain and old cedar heavy in the air. Maria pulled the sliding glass door shut, the metal track grinding slightly from a buildup of salt and grit. She turned to face me. The pale yellow silk of her wrap dress caught the muted, bruised light filtering through the porch screens. She adjusted the fabric at her waist, her fingers twisting the material with a nervous energy that didn't match the forced calm of her posture. On the small wicker table to her right, a glass of lemonade sat half empty, a slice of lemon resting against the rim. "Does it sit straight to you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the frayed edge of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days. I looked at the dress, noting how the hem dipped slightly on the left, but my focus caught on the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her breath, waiting for an answer to a question that had nothing to do with silk. "The hem is off by a fraction," I said, my voice steady. I kept my hands firmly in the pockets of my canvas work pants. The fabric was rough against my knuckles. "But I don't think that's what you're actually asking me, Maria." She let out a shaky exhale and dropped her hand from the dress. "Vance left a notice taped to the front door this morning." The safety inspector. I had dealt with Vance before on other jobs down the coast. He was a man who enjoyed the small power of a clipboard and a red pen. "Show me," I said. She walked over to the wicker table, bypassing the lemonade, and picked up a folded piece of heavy yellow paper. She handed it to me. Her fingers were cold. I took the paper, making sure our skin didn't brush. It was a formal citation. Structural compromise in the primary load-bearing ledger board of the main event deck. 30 days to repair, or the property's commercial license would be suspended. For a woman who ran weddings and retreats out of this house to pay the mortgage, it was an eviction notice with a polite header. "Leo doesn't know," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. Leo, my best friend. The guy who was currently 3 states away at a tech conference, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was quietly drowning in municipal paperwork. "He doesn't need to know yet," I told her, scanning the exact code violations Vance had cited. Section 4, paragraph B, rotted fasteners. "I can fix this." "Jackson, no." She shook her head, a strand of blonde hair escaping the loose clip at the back of her neck. "You're supposed to be on vacation. You came down here to surf and sleep on the couch, not to rebuild my foundation." "The surf is blown out by the storm system anyway," I said, folding the paper and putting it in my shirt pocket. "And I don't sleep well." I walked past her, out the secondary screen door that led to the expansive back deck. The wind immediately grabbed at my shirt. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. I knelt on the weathered gray composite boards and leaned over the edge, shining my phone's flashlight underneath. The damage was worse than Vance had written. The half-inch galvanized lag screws had succumbed to a decade of salt air. The galvanic corrosion had eaten through the zinc coating, allowing rust to turn the steel into brittle flakes. The ledger board itself, a pressure-treated 2x10, was pulling away from the house's band joist by a full 1/4 inch. Another heavy rainstorm, or a wedding party of 50 people dancing, and the sheer strength of the remaining bolts would fail. The whole structure would detach. I stood up. Maria was watching me through the screen, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the kitchen behind her. "It's bad," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's repairable," I corrected. "I need my truck. I need 6-inch structural timber screws, a secondary temporary beam to carry the load while I remove the old one, and 2 hydraulic jacks." I devoted exactly that much breath to the technical reality, then looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, the panic finally breaking through the polished exterior she always maintained. "I don't have the money to pay your contracting rate, Jackson. I know what you charge in the city." I stepped back inside the porch, letting the screen door click shut behind me. The sudden silence of the enclosed space was a heavy blanket against the rising wind outside. "I didn't hand you an invoice, Maria. I can't accept charity from my son's friend." The class divide she always felt around my clients, and by extension my work, flared up. She saw herself as the struggling widow, and me as the guy who built custom architectural staircases for millionaires. "It's not charity. It's a trade." I looked at the half-empty glass on the table. "I need a place to stay for the next 2 weeks while my apartment lease turns over. You need a deck that won't collapse. We trade." She stared at me, searching for pity. She found none. I kept my posture relaxed, unthreatening, a steady anchor in the middle of her spinning world. "Okay," she whispered. The tremor in her voice stopped. The first heavy drops of rain hit the metal roof of the porch, sounding like scattered buckshot. The storm had arrived. By Tuesday morning, the house smelled like damp earth and black coffee. I was up at 5, measuring out the replacement timber in the side yard. The routine established itself quickly. I worked. She managed the phone calls and the cancellations for the upcoming weekend, preserving her business's reputation by citing proactive upgrades. Around 10, I was underneath the deck. The mud was thick, clinging to my boots and the knees of my denim. I had the 2 20-ton hydraulic bottle jacks positioned on thick steel plates, slowly lifting the temporary support beam I'd constructed. "Jackson!" I stopped pumping the jack handle. I looked up. Maria was standing at the edge of the lattice skirting, holding a thermos and a clean towel. She was wearing old jeans and a faded gray sweatshirt, looking more real than she ever did in the silk dresses. "You've been under there for 4 hours, she said. "Had to get the weight off the ledger before the wood dried out too much," I explained, sliding out from the crawl space. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag from my back pocket. She handed me the towel. I took it, wiping the sweat and grit from my forehead. She unscrewed the thermos and poured a cup of black coffee, handing it to me. The transfer of the hot plastic cup was smooth. My fingers brushed the side of her thumb. It wasn't electricity. It was gravity. A sudden, heavy grounding. The chaotic noise of the highway a mile over seemed to vanish. "Thank you," I said, taking a slow sip. She looked at the massive temporary beam I had wedged under the joists. "It looks like you're holding up the whole world under there." "Just the deck, Maria." "Vance called," she said, her voice dropping a fraction. "He said he's doing a drive-by inspection on Thursday. He doesn't believe I actually hired a licensed contractor in time. He thinks I'm stalling." I lowered the cup. Thursday wasn't the date on the notice. "I know, but he's the authority. If he sees it's not permitted correctly, he'll red tag the door." I felt the familiar tightening in my jaw. I set the coffee cup down on the tailgate of my truck. I walked over to the passenger side, opened the door, and pulled out my clipboard. I grabbed a pen and walked back to her. "We don't stall," I said. "We plan." I flipped the clipboard to a clean sheet of grid paper. I sketched the load path, the temporary support, and the fastener schedule. I wrote down the exact municipal code exemptions for emergency structural stabilization. I handed her the pen. "You're going to go to the county clerk's office right now. Not Vance, the clerk. You file this stabilization plan under an emergency weather permit. By the time Vance drives by on Thursday, this piece of paper will be taped to your front door." She took the clipboard. She looked at the precise, dark lines of my sketch, then up at me. The panic that had been simmering in her eyes began to cool. "You're sure this will work?" she asked. "I don't guess, Maria. I build." She let out a breath, a genuine sound of relief, and nodded. She walked toward her car, her step lighter, the burden visibly shifted. I watched her go, keeping my hands at my sides. I wanted to follow her, to tell her she didn't have to worry about a single thing as long as I was standing there. But I turned my longing into discipline. I picked up my tools, crawled back into the mud, and went back to work. Thursday arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat. I was on the deck, driving the final heavy-duty structural screws into the new ledger board with a high-torque impact driver. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the tool was the only sound in the yard. A white county vehicle pulled into the gravel driveway. Mr. Vance stepped out, a clipboard pressed against his chest. He wore a short-sleeved button-down shirt and a look of practiced disappointment. I set the driver down and walked to the edge of the deck, wiping my hands. "Mr. Hart," Vance said, recognizing me from a commercial build downtown last year. He sounded annoyed to see me.
"Didn't expect to find you out here in the residential limits."
"Taking a side project, Vance," I said, leaning against the railing. Maria stepped out of the front door. She stood on the porch, her posture rigid. "I came to tag the property, Mrs. Bird," Vance said, loud enough to project over the yard. "You can't just start tearing down structural supports without a full engineering review." I walked down the deck stairs, putting myself between Vance and the porch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The structural supports aren't torn down," I said quietly. "They are actively bypassed by a temporary carrying beam, rated for 10,000 pounds. The old ledger is removed, the flashing is replaced with a custom-bent copper drip edge, and the new ledger is fastened with code-compliant structural screws every 8 inches. Vance frowned, looking past me. "I still need to see the permit." Maria stepped forward. She didn't look at me for permission. She walked straight to the wooden post of the porch and pointed to the yellow permit sheet encased in a plastic sleeve stamped with the red ink of the county clerk. "Emergency stabilization permit, Mr. Vance," Maria said, her voice completely steady. "Filed and approved on Tuesday morning. We are fully compliant." Vance stared at the stamp. He looked at the massive, perfectly aligned temporary beam holding up the deck. He looked at me, then at Maria. The leverage he thought he had evaporated into the humid air. "I'll need to do a final inspection when the temporary beam is removed," he muttered, making a note on his clipboard. "I'll have the final load path calculations ready for you on Sunday," I told him. "Have a good afternoon, Vance." He got back in his truck and drove away, the tires kicking up gravel. I turned around. Maria was leaning against the porch post. She looked at the yellow paper, then closed her eyes. I walked up the steps, stopping 2 feet away from her. "You did good," I said. She opened her eyes. "No, you did good. You gave me the shield. I just held it up." "You stood your ground," I corrected her. She looked at me, really looked at me for a long moment. The space between us felt suddenly very small. I focused on the sound of the wind in the coastal pines. I kept my hands in my pockets. "Leo called last night," she said quietly. The mention of my best friend was a bucket of cold water. "He wanted to know how the weather was," she continued, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. "I didn't tell him you were fixing the house. I don't know why I lied, Jackson. It just felt complicated." "It's not complicated, Maria. I'm fixing a deck." "Is that all you're doing?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the resilience in her posture, the way she refused to break down. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to tell her that I was fixing the deck because I couldn't stand the thought of her house collapsing, of her world collapsing. Instead, I stepped back. "I need to finish driving the bolts before it rains again," I said. I turned and walked back to the impact driver. It was the hardest thing I did all week. The final storm hit on Sunday evening. It wasn't just rain. It was a coastal squall that turned the sky green and whipped the trees into frantic, violent arcs. The power went out at 7. I was in the kitchen packing up my tool bags by the light of a battery-powered lantern. The deck was finished. The temporary beam was out. The structure was completely sound. The back door rattled violently against its frame. Maria was in the living room trying to secure a loose window sash that was letting water stream onto the hardwood floor. I walked over, took the sash from her hands, and pushed it upward with a sharp, controlled burst of force, locking the brass latch into place. The water immediately stopped. "Thank you," she breathed, stepping back in the dark. The lantern light threw long shadows across the room. "The house is secure," I told her. "The deck isn't going anywhere." "I know," she said. She wrapped her arms around herself. "It's so quiet when the power goes out. You hear every creak. It's just the wood settling into the new joints." We stood in the center of the living room, the wind howling outside. The physical labor was done. The excuse of the project was gone. My truck was packed. Tomorrow morning I would drive back to the city. "I transferred the payment to your account," she said, breaking the silence. I frowned. "We had a trade." "I canceled it," she said firmly. "I logged into the portal and paid your standard commercial day rate. I used the deposit from the wedding I just booked for next month." "Maria." "No," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not the struggling widow anymore, Jackson. I am the owner of this property. You did the work. You get paid the worth of your work. That was my boundary." I looked at her, standing tall in the dim light, claiming her agency, refusing to be indebted, refusing to be small. Respect flared in my chest, hot and absolute. "Okay," I said quietly. She took a step closer. The wind battered the side of the house, but inside, the silence between us became absolute. It was the quiet room. The noise of the world, of Vance, of the storm, of the complicated optics, it all vanished. "You kept your hands in your pockets all week," she whispered, looking down at my sides. "I did." "Why?" "Because if I took them out, I wouldn't have been fixing the house." She looked up at me. There was no fear in her eyes, only a steady, certain arrival. She reached out and placed her hand flat against my chest, right over my heartbeat. Her palm was warm. It wasn't a spark, it was a stabilizer. The subtle tremor I carried in my jaw, the weariness of constant movement. It stopped. The world stopped spinning. I took my hands out of my pockets. I placed my hands on her shoulders, the touch functional, grounding. I didn't pull her hard against me, I just held her steady in the dark. I leaned down and kissed her. It was a destination. There was no frantic exploration, no desperate hunger. It was the heavy, absolute feeling of locking a massive timber into place, a promise sealed without words, a sudden realization of home. When I pulled back, she kept her hand on my chest. We didn't say anything else. We just listened to the rain, safe inside the structure we had stabilized. Monday morning was clear and bright. The coast smelled of ozone and washed pine. I was standing by my truck, tossing the last heavy canvas bag into the bed. Maria walked out onto the newly repaired deck. She had a thick manila folder in her hands. Vance's white truck pulled into the driveway. He got out, looking at the deck with a critical eye. He walked over, inspected the joints, ran his hand along the copper flashing, and checked the bolt spacing. He couldn't find a single flaw. "It passes," Vance said, signing a green tag and handing it to Maria. "Solid work, Hart." "Always is," I said. Vance drove away. Maria walked down the deck stairs and handed me the manila folder. "What's this?" I asked. "A retainer contract," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the yard. "For ongoing structural maintenance and property management, 12 months, signed and dated." I opened the folder. It was a formal agreement, laying out terms, dates, and fair compensation. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a practical, permanent anchor. It was a reason to stay. I looked at her. She wasn't asking for a savior. She was offering a partnership. I pulled a pen from my shirt pocket. I placed the folder on the hood of my truck and signed my name next to hers. I handed the folder back to her. I reached out and took her hand in the morning light. It was a simple, public choice. "I'll see you on Friday," I said. "Drive safe," she replied, her fingers steady in mine. I learned that true strength isn't about carrying the whole world alone. It's about trusting someone enough to let them share the load. Real partnership is built on the quiet, steady actions that create a safe place to stand. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.